Hello, everybody. I'm Vicky Pryce. I am Chair of Fellows at Radix Big Tent, which is the think tank that you've all registered to listen to our event this afternoon. I'm going to just introduce the whole event, and then I will leave it to Ben Rich, who is the Chief Executive of Radix Big Tent, to run the discussion with Iain. But before I'll tell you some of these housekeeping things that you have to listen to. I have to say that I am so delighted that we're having Iain Dale as the person whose book, his latest book, he's written so many books, we are discussing this afternoon, and hopefully there'll be lots of questions from the audience. You've already, in fact, posted a few, and there'll be more. Just put them in the chat if you can, anything new. But Iain published when he was at Bite Back, my very first proper book. I had written loads of essays, if you like, chapters for other books, but he published my Greekonomics book right at the height of the Eurozone crisis, and then reprinted it with an update. And then amazingly, it's because of all his efforts and his teams, it made it into the shortlist of just the final 4 for Business Book of the Year, for which I'm really grateful. So, and he's published a lot of my other books after that, and Bite Back has continued to do so even after he left. So Iain, I owe you a lot. And plus I do the odd interview with you at LBC, a very, very successful venture of yours in terms of the issues you cover. So I will just very quickly say that, first of all, delighted to have you all. Please switch the cameras off just as you've been told, only because, you know, that way we can accommodate everybody more easily in terms of the Wi-Fi. And also mute yourselves if you haven't done so already. You can unmute yourself right at the end to give your thanks to Iain and the rest. But if you have any questions, just put them in chat. The event is in any case being recorded, so you can have copies of that at some point, and also those who have registered but haven't for some reason been able to connect for whatever reason will get the recording as well. What you're also going to see every now and then in the chat is a link to Iain's book. It will be posted at various intervals, so do acquire it. He is going to wave the odd copy around, so will Ben. So that would be good reminder for you. Also to say that please support the foundation, the Radix Big Tent Foundation, as a friend or with a one-off donation. So there again going to be some information about that in the chat, but also on the website. So what I want to do then now is just introduce you to Ben, who is going to do the discussion with Iain. I'll come again at the end. When I reappear, I'm going to switch my camera off. It means that we're near the end and Ben should take note. So see you all later. Good luck, Ben. Thank you.
Thank you. And look, I don't know, for those who are regulars on these Radix Big Tent webinars, you'll know I don't normally chair. In fact, Vicky and I have swapped roles, but I was really keen to do this one because your book, Iain, was my Christmas present from my wife, who had heard you being interviewed on Fee and Jane and thought that's for Ben. And she's absolutely right.
What lessons do you draw from that, Ben?
Well, I'm really not sure. But you do very well, because she felt the need to buy me the heavy book, and I live in York and spend my life commuting down to London. And for the first couple of times, you know, I've sort of left it at home because it was just way too heavy to carry on the train. And then I got so into it, I had to carry it on the train. And by the end, I thought, this isn't worth carrying on the train. And I've bought your Kindle version as well. So it was a particularly fortuitous listen that she had, because you got two sales out of that.
Excellent.
So look, I'm really pleased with doing this, and you know, your name is one which I've known for a long time, and we've talked occasionally in the past, but very well known around anyone in politics. You're one of the leading political commentators, presenters, bloggers, I think, in the country. I should say, for anybody who still doesn't So Iain is presenter on LBC. He's won numerous awards. He's presented the election shows on LBC and the American elections, referendums. Dictators, is it fair Iain, to say it's sort of one of the series of books made up of chapters by interesting authors? Um,
Yeah, it started off back in 2021. It was the 300th anniversary of Robert Walpole becoming Prime Minister. And I assumed that somebody must have written a book or edited a book of which would include profiles of all the Prime Ministers. But to my astonishment, I mean, Andrew Jimson had done one, but it was sort of very, very short. And so I put together a whole sort of jigsaw of contributors, some famous, some not, politicians, journalists, academics, historians, and it sold massively, far more than the publishers ever thought it would. So that then led on to American presidents, that led on to kings and queens, and that's led on to dictators. And next year there's generals. So it's a format which seems to have worked. I mean, I often feel when I'm doing things like this, I feel a bit of a fraud because although my name's on the cover, I did not write the book. I usually write one essay in the book, and I've written on General Galtieri in this one. And I'm always fearful that interviewers are going to say, bring up some obscure aspect of the life of Idi Amin or something and expect me to know chapter and verse about Idi Amin. Be careful of that one, Ben. Treat me kindly.
okay, well, so I wanted to start by asking you where Hastings band down. I'll put that on one side for the moment. Um, and we pick up from that, that obviously you're a publisher. Vicky's talked about your time at Bite Back, and you really understand this world. I wanted to start. I mean, I guess we're going to spend a lot of time talking about current dictators and leading politicians, but before we sort of dive into that, I am fascinated by the people you've got writing for you for this book, and I'd really love to just understand, how you identified your authors.
Well, there are two ways of doing this. I'm putting together another similar book at the moment called Power Brokers and Political Fixers. And rather than send an email out to all of the contributors for the different books saying, look, do you want to contribute to this? And if so, who would you like to bid for? I've decided on this one to approach people individually. And because it is important that you get a mix of, you want well-known people. So, I mean, I suppose the most well-known historian in this book is Richard J. Evans, who wrote the chapter on Hitler, and he is the world's foremost historian on the Third Reich. Also happened to be my tutor at the University of East Anglia for a year and back in the day. And we've kept in touch over the years. And I thought, I mean, I didn't expect him to agree to do this, partly on the basis of, well, what is there new to say about Hitler? But the joy of a book like this, it gives authors like Richard the chance to say something new and sort of develop a political angle. Simon Heffer, who I think has contributed to every single one of the books, he does exactly the same. His essay on Franco here, I think, is one of the best in the book. It's slightly revisionist, by which I don't mean he's saying Franco's a great guy, but he's sort of reinterpreting Franco in a really interesting way. So you've got his famous historians like them. But one of the other things I try and do in all of the books is to give an opportunity to young people who have no name in the world of political writing or history writing. And I've got two or three of my LBC colleagues have written articles in the books. A guy called Connor Hand, who I think is 28, his essay in the British general elections book on the 1831 election, everyone reading it will imagine that he's a professional historian. It was just so brilliant. There's several in here that my former producer Robbie Hawkins, who's now on Newsnight, let me remind myself, he wrote, was it Ho Chi Minh, I think he wrote about. And again, a really, really insightful chapter. And we've got politicians, Robert Buckland, Nick Thomas Simmons, and I mean, just it's a real mixture. And some of them are obvious, where you know someone has got a particular interest in or particular expertise on a particular person or period in history, so you try and match them to that person. Others rather like writing about somebody that they've never even heard of because they like the research, doing the research for it. Um, and it's just when I get to the final one, I'm always rather sad that that process is finished because it's actually the process, the whole publishing process for a book like this. That's the bit I find most enjoyable.
Well, I mean, I was fascinated actually by the really personal stories, and some of those were the politicians. So Brooks Newmark talk
Yeah.
about his relationship with Bashar al-Assad is absolutely fascinating. Did you know about that before you approached him?
Yes, I did. I mean that is an interesting one because what I do when I've got all of the writers sorted, I then write a style guide because that it is quite important to have. You don't want it to be 64 essays with 64 different styles. Now, inevitably, there will be differences, and you can't really iron all of those out in the editing process. But I gave Brooks a lot more latitude. I do encourage people to be opinionated. I don't just want a sort of rather boring biography, sort of, and then he did this and then he did that. I mean, who wants to read that? You can look at that on Wikipedia. So I do encourage the authors to offer their opinions and indeed to be reasonably controversial. But when you've got somebody who's met the subject on numerous occasions. I mean, it would be mad not to include that in it. So that is a slightly different chapter. For example, also in the British general election campaigns book, I got Stephen Parkinson, Lord Parkinson, to write about the 2017 election because he was intimately involved with it, working as he did for Theresa May. So, of course, his essay is rather different from a lot of the others in the books. Now, I mean, the purists might think that that's a bit of an odd approach to take, but I'm not doing this as an academic exercise. The whole point of these books is to introduce people to the different dictators, the different monarchs, the different prime ministers, in the hope that if one of them really grabs your attention, you then go and buy a proper book. This is a proper book, but a proper biography of them, a full-length biography. But I mean, frankly, very few people are going to go and buy a biography of Hastings Banda. But they might have heard of Hastings Banda, but that's all they know about him. And you're willing to read 8 or 9 pages on Hastings Banda, but you wouldn't want to read 300. And that's where I think these books can really, I mean, they're of their time in a sense, because we keep being told, well, everybody has the attention span of a flea. So I suppose it does play into that narrative a little bit.
But I mean, I found it fascinating that how many of these people I realized that I knew nothing more than their name.
Yeah.
So, uh, I think that I know that Ulbricht was a bad man.
Well, I think virtually all of the people in this book you could describe as bad men. I mean, there is one woman in it, but that's sort. It's very funny. The publishers kept saying to me in all of these books, they always want more women, and I said, well, look, I can't invent female dictators. I mean, it's just not possible. And they said, well, I remember in the Prime Minister's book, they said, can't you get more female writers? I said, well, if you can provide me a list of female political historians or female political journalists who would do this, and I mean, slightly controversially, it's very rare that a man says no to doing essays in these books. But in this one, I had 15 women say no. Now, I don't know what conclusion to draw from that, but it's. I mean, people can come up with their own theories as to why that would be, and I genuinely try to get at least a decent gender balance, which we did in Kings and Queens, because there's this whole genre of female royal historians, which I didn't know existed. So I got a lot of them involved, and some of them have actually written for Dictators too. But just finishing on the how you do the book, what I've also learned, having done 5 or 6 of these now, is that there's always a couple that are very late. One in one of the books actually told me on deadline day, oh no, I can't do it anymore. I'm thinking, well, what do you expect me to do? And this was actually a really good friend of mine. I was absolutely furious. So I had to end up writing the chapter myself, which I actually quite enjoyed doing. And then you always get one that is actually awful. I mean, I can't obviously name them, but there was somebody in one of the books who delivered this essay, and this person is a professional writer. and it read as if it had been written by a 12-year-old. And I thought, what do I do? And this person had quite a big national name. So in the end, I rewrote it. And this was on a person, on a subject that I really didn't know much about. So I rewrote it and then sent it back to them, and rather fearing what the response might be. And they said, "Oh, you've done a magnificent job on this, haven't you?" And I then sent it to somebody. I sent the whole manuscript to a professor. Again, I don't want to say which book it was, and said, "I want you to tell me which of these essays I've had to rescue." And in the end, he said he couldn't. And I suppose when I told him which one it was, he said, "Oh, I thought that was a really good one." So, but that happens in every book. There's always one or two problem authors, which as an editor, he does present you with quite a few problems.
Yeah, I can imagine. Look, we should probably get into the book. And one of the things which strikes me as different, of course, about this book from your earlier ones is, if you're going to do the prime ministers or the presidents, you've got a fixed list.
Yes.
And here you've got a massively floating list. So the second question is, how did you decide which subjects to include? Who do you regret leaving out?
Well, there were quite a few that I think I had a list of about 130 that I mean, actually used social media. I said, "Look, who do you think I should, I mean, obviously don't say Hitler. Obviously Hitler's going to be in, Chairman Mao is going to be in, but which of the sort of slightly more obscure ones do you think I should include and make your case?" And I mean, that was quite a good process. While I'm talking, I'm actually going to bring up the spreadsheet if I can find it, and I can tell you which ones didn't make the cut. But it is entirely subjective. And it's partly down to the fact that if I thought they would be interesting, then I'm thinking, well, lots of other people will think they'll be interesting. And it was sort of almost done on that basis. Sorry, I'm just flicking through this spreadsheet. I think I might have deleted all the ones that we didn't include but yeah, they're not on the spreadsheet anymore. But it is really difficult. It was supposed to be 50 dictators, and in the end, it turned out to be 64, which the publishers thought was far too many. But I said, well, I don't know which ones to take out. They've all got to be a certain length to really mean anything. But it did mean that the book turned out to be what 570 pages. So it's priced at £30, which as a former publisher, I sort of slightly winced when they said it was going to be £30. And I genuinely think it's actually been a barrier, even though obviously virtually nobody ever pays £30. I think it has been a barrier. This has not sold as successfully as say the prime ministers did, or kings and queens. But given the times we're in, you would have thought it ought to have really caught a wave.
It could perhaps be time for another push. I ask you who you regret not including. Wonder, Vladimir Zelensky, would he have been a candidate?
Very droll. No, he wouldn't. I genuinely can't remember who didn't make the cut now. It's so long ago. I mean, I think all of the main ones are in there. I mean, it's people like Bokassa, for example. I mean, there's a lot of African dictators to choose from. And I suppose if I have one regret, I'm thinking, should I have included more of those than I did? I mean, there are, I think, 5 or 6, but I could have probably put in a lot more. But it also comes down to, how do you define a dictator? Now, if you use Donald Trump's definition, then you could say that most political leaders are dictators. I think quite a lot of them are aspirant, benign dictators. And nobody can really agree on the definition of the word dictator. There are lots of things that dictators have in common, but they are all different to each other. And if you look at, I've got the Oxford English Dictionary definition here. It says, an absolute ruler of a state, especially one whose rule displaces that of a democratic government. Well, of course, many dictators were elected and indeed, like Putin, continue to be elected. So I'm not sure that that's the best definition. The Cambridge Dictionary says a leader who has complete power in a country but has not been elected by the people. Well, again, that means that Putin isn't a dictator. There are so many in here that were elected. I mean, there are many that grab power themselves. So I don't think that word, that definition really works. And if you look at the origins of the word dictator, it comes from, I don't know whether it's dicio or dicio, to exert authority or make a decision or to be decisive. And if you go back to ancient Rome, again, the word dictator, it wasn't a pejorative word. We all think of it as a negative word, but in ancient Rome it wasn't, because they would have two, I can't remember if they were called counselors, that would rule side by side, and they would only give away to a single ruler if there was some emergency or crisis, and that person was then known as the dictator. But again, that was seen as a positive thing. Now that person would only rule until the crisis was over, and then they would go back to the dual ruler.
And their job was really to take a decision. So this is
Yeah.
dictator in the terms of somebody who's able to take the decision. I don't know if it's a flip comment by you and Grant in the chat, but no Benjamin Netanyahu, but actually just listening to your definition, whatever one thinks of Benjamin Netanyahu, this is absolutely not an absolute ruler. His whole strategies are driven by trying to keep in his coalition different supporters, very diverse selections of people. So it does make it quite hard. And you haven't translated dictator directly as bad person, have you, in this?
No, and if you go back to the days when Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister, she was often accused of being a quasi-dictator for the way that she supposedly handled her cabinet. My next book is actually a short biography of her. And at the end, I've got 12 myths about Margaret Thatcher, and one of them is that, I mean, she wasn't a dictator. She actually relished a lot of argument. And but she was very good at making decisions. Now, under one of these definitions, that would mean that she was a dictator. And obviously people who hated her when she was Prime Minister were happy to describe her in that way. But in a sense, it played into the whole sort of Iron Lady thing, which was the best thing the Soviets could have ever done to call her that. But one of the contexts is, and I didn't know this before I started editing the book, 70% of the world's population live under a dictatorship in 52 different countries. I mean, that is an incredible statistic, and I suspect that figure is only going to go up over the next 10 or 20 years.
And by dictator, that's 70%. They're referring to people who live in countries where they haven't directly elected the leader, or?
Well, yes, or in countries where they have elected their leader, but you have to be rather dubious about the elections. I mean, Russia being a prime example, Belarus as well. I mean, apart from Donald Trump, I think everybody else thinks of Vladimir Putin as a dictator. But he would say, well, hang on a minute, I was elected with sort of, what was it, 80 or 90% of the vote. Well, I think there'll be a lot of people who suspect the Russian electoral system of not being quite what it ought to be, and that many people wouldn't vote because they probably feared the consequences of their vote.
One thing that really struck me as I was reading about the dictators was not only how many of them had originally been elected, but how many of them either originally or since then felt the need for the fig leaf of an election, even if it was one which they went on to fix.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting one there is actually General Pinochet, who I think virtually everybody who's on this call at the moment, everybody would think of him as a thoroughly bad man. And he was. I mean, did evil things. But he did have elections, and he abided by the result of those elections. He actually handed over power peacefully, but we don't think of him in that way. We just look at all of the torture and think that he was a stereotypical dictator wearing sunglasses in a uniform with a funny hat, and that does typify many dictators. Sorry, my dogs have just entered the room.
So, I mean, that leads me on to, I'm going to ask a question which we got in advance from John Cornell, who asks, you talk about benign dictatorship in your introduction, or is that an oxymoron? by definition, bad people.
Well, I mean, see, this is where we have to be really careful not to try to judge everyone else in the world by what we're used to or what we think of is the ideal system of government. Some cultures prefer security and stability over freedom. I mean, that is just a fact. It might sound slightly patronizing to say that, but it is true. And you have to ask, well, is a bad democracy worse than a benign dictatorship? I mean, often it isn't. And this is where I did have a few qualms about who to include in the book. And I have included Lee Kuan Yew, who was elected by big majorities. Sorry, I didn't hear that.
Remind us, Lee.
Well, he was Lee Kuan Yew. He was a leader of Singapore for many, many years. And he's somebody, again, I knew a bit about, but not very much. And I thought, well, he's such an interesting figure. Let's put him in, even though he doesn't really meet the ultimate definition of what most people would think a dictator was. He didn't have secret police. He was very, sorry, let me just go and hang on. The dogs are just making lots of noise, and unfortunately, my partner didn't shut the door on his way out. But I'll WhatsApp him while I'm speaking.
Let you shut
So he didn't have death squads. He didn't have secret police. Yes, I think there was tight control of the media in many ways. But you ask a typical person from Singapore whether they think that Lee Kuan Yew was, all things being equal, a good leader. And he increased the lot of the people. Ordinary Singaporeans were richer during his time than they were before his time. So naturally, there is a tendency then to think of him as a very good leader. You look at others. I mean, Oliver Cromwell isn't in the book, but was in the Kings and Queens book. And yes, I know he wasn't a king, but it seemed odd not to have that period included in the book. Now, you could say, I mean, I'm not sure quite if you would ever describe him as benevolent, but he wasn't quite the dictator that some of the others were in the book. Admiral Horthy of Hungary, Ataturk, Tito. I mean, Tito and Ataturk, I think, they probably represent the benign dictator better than anyone else, because I think they did genuinely have the well-being of their country at the heart of what they were trying to do. And Ataturk, again, is one of these figures that outside Turkey, we've kind of heard of him, but do we really know what he did? But he did a lot of good things for Turkey. So, and Tito, the same for Yugoslavia. And he held Yugoslavia together in a way that I'm not sure anyone else could have done. And we saw the consequences of what happened when he died. So I think the whole concept of benign dictatorship is a fascinating one. And there's a sprinkling of them throughout the book.
I'm really struck, actually, whether the first job of government is actually to secure a better life for their citizens, and that doesn't necessarily require a democracy. So I don't know if you see the Edelman published their trust barometer each year, and they poll in every country, and when they ask, which governments are most popular, this year it's China and Saudi Arabia and UAE at the top, and you've got Germany and Spain, Germany before the election, I suspect, and Spain and Japan right at the bottom. So, what's going on there? Is it really, do we actually really not care very much about whether our governments are elected, or indeed how they proceed, as long as they're producing some economic growth that gets shared around?
Well, there is an aspect of that, I think, and this is what we find so difficult to understand in this country. You look at Donald Trump. Now, we might want to talk about him in a moment as a sort of possible aspirant dictator. That's what a lot of people accuse him of. But we in this country not only do not understand how the American people have voted for Donald Trump, we don't seem to have much interest in it either. We regard him, and again, generally, we regard him as a thoroughly bad man, not just bad, but misogynistic, predatory, corrupt, etc., etc. Throw virtually any negative adjective and you can pin it to Donald Trump. And this is what I tried. I mean, I find him an incredibly difficult character to cover as a broadcaster, because you feel that as though you've got to kind of play devil's advocate sometimes with Donald Trump. But then I find myself, because I say one positive thing about him, or something that he has done well, and he didn't, his whole first term wasn't an unmitigated disaster in foreign policy. I think he actually did some good things. But you say that, and then because of the way that social media is now, you are then classified as a Trump supporter, even though I make clear time and time again, I would never vote for him in a month of Sundays. But that's just the way people are. But why is it that outside the United States, people just make no effort to try and understand the essence of his popularity? I've never really understood that. And it's similar in many other countries with dictators, where we just assume that because they are dictatorships, that they're all thoroughly evil. And as I say, many of them are. I mean, one of the best chapters in the book is by Tim Stanley on Papa Doc Duvalier and Baby Doc Duvalier. And the horrendous things that they did, you think, well, how could anybody find that? How could anybody want to support them? But they had huge support in Haiti at the time. Well, certainly the father did at the time. Nowadays, I'm not sure you'd find many people advocating for them. But it's. I just think we tend to sit in our comfortable Western environment and just look down our noses at people who have different systems to those that we do. And yet we can see that, because particularly at the moment, where in this country we have a class of politicians that I would say almost getting onto a majority of people are thoroughly hacked off with. Now, I don't think that we're heading for a dictatorship, but I can certainly see the circumstances of Nigel Farage becoming Prime Minister at the next election. He wouldn't get a parliamentary majority, but I could see him leading a minority government, because if the Conservatives continue in their turmoil, if Labour doesn't deliver on many of its promises that they made at the last election, it'll be a plague on all of your houses. Now, in the past, those votes would have gone to the Liberal Democrats. Well, there's lots of choices now. You have got the Liberal Democrats, you've got Reform, you've got the Greens. There could be some left-wing party that emerges over the next couple of years. And that means that it will become very difficult to predict what could happen. Now, I'm not predicting that Nigel Farage will become Prime Minister, but I wrote a piece in September where I said that I thought there was a 10% chance. Now I think there's probably a 20% chance. And you can see which way that bandwagon is heading. That's all I'm saying.
So that's really interesting. I mean, if the common trait isn't necessarily around elections, and if dictators are delivering economic success in lots of cases,
yeah,
that seems to mean, to take you into a place where actually dictators bad, discuss, not necessarily. But one of the other traits which the vast majority of your candidates here have, and maybe one of the concerns that people have when they look at somebody like Trump, is about the othering of people. So one of the things that dictators use to make themselves popular, obviously, as a theme of the book, is to say your misfortune is not your fault.
Yeah.
And that's common, whether it's Peron or Hitler or Gaddafi. I mean, it goes on and on. It's the most common trait. And I think, some of us would say you can see that very much in Trump. Approach as well, and in Putin's approach.
Yeah, but I don't think that is restricted to dictators. I mean, you're right. Virtually every dictator does do that, but there are plenty of democratic leaders that have done that over the years as well. But just on Donald Trump, I just want to read you a few paragraphs from one of the chapters in the book. It's called "The Psychology of a Dictator," and it's by Professor Ian Robertson from Trinity College, Dublin. And this, when I read this for the first time, it really did, because I've always dismissed people who say Trump is an aspirant dictator, but just listen to this. He writes, Being God is a lonely business, which is why dictators like to spend time with other dictators. There is no chummy camaraderie with your highest placed subordinates in a dictatorship because everyone is a potential threat, even your family. If you are all powerful, then you are totally alone. You have nothing in common with other human beings, only with other gods. This is what makes Donald Trump's infatuation with dictators so unsettling. About Kim Jong-un, he said, and then we fell in love, okay? No, really. He wrote me beautiful letters, and they're great letters. And Vladimir Putin. So Putin is now saying it's independent, a large section of Ukraine. I said, how smart is that? And he's going to go in and be a peacekeeper. All dictators hate constitutions, laws, and judges, and will always try to subvert them. But usually this happens gradually over time, a slow whittling away of anything that might constrain their omnipotence. What is so alarming about Donald Trump is that he started this so early in his presidency, from trying to get the Department of Justice to become a loyal and partisan vehicle for his leadership, culminating in attempted insurrection of the peaceful transfer of power to new legally elected president. Trump's wealth and celebrity has already created many of the features of power addiction and consequent personality distortion that all political dictators show. 4 years as president stoked that vast appetite for ever more power, and the hunger is greater than ever, along with, of course, the terrified fight to ward off a long jail sentence arising from his 91 felony counts. Dictators are much less vulnerable to removal by a popular uprising or cabinet conspiracy in the 21st century than they were in earlier times. This is because mass surveillance technology, including face recognition, allows dictators to control whole populations, even when plagued by poverty and corruption. There is, for example, in Russia, a widely available user-friendly mobile phone app to allow you easily to report a neighbour, friend, colleague, or stranger on the street for anti-state comments. Nearly finished. It is not an accident that almost all dictators are men. It is for similar reasons that most compulsive gamblers are male, that most drunk drivers are men, and that most murderers have the XY chromosome in their cells. There are biological, psychological, and social reasons why men predominate in these domains. But what is clear is that the most enlightened countries with the happiest populations tend to empower women at the highest levels to a greater extent than do other regimes that are more bound to traditional male hyper-dominance patterns of governance. If the world can elect more women leaders, then it is very likely that fewer of them will mutate into dictators. Interesting, don't you think?
We were having beforehand about the fact that your publishers desperately wanted you to find more female dictators. You came
Yeah.
up.
Well, the only one in the book is Wu Zetian, who I think still people say is probably the most powerful woman ever to have lived. She was, what, 7th century China. I mean, I'd never heard of her, I have to say, before doing the book.
And quite difficult to translate over to modern day dictators. You made the comment earlier, and it takes two to tango in a funny sort of way. You describe Trump, you describe the attributes of a dictator, and suggest to us that maybe we see that in Trump. But it also takes a people who are perhaps psychologically more aligned to a dictator. And you made the comment earlier that some cultures might be happier with dictators. When we think about Trump, actually, is it a change Trump, or is the change in the American people? And do you think that America is psychologically set up? If he got to the end of his term, seemed to be successful, if he said, I think it's in everyone's interest that you get another go at the Donald, what sort of response do you think he'd get?
I have thought about that one because I mean, it's actually quite difficult to change the American Constitution, and it would have to be a constitutional change, I think. But I mean, anything's possible. I think his age probably mitigates against that. I think it's difficult for him to criticise Joe Biden the way he did and then head down the same road himself. But I mean, who knows? I mean, if he really does believe he is some sort of demigod that America cannot do without, I suppose you could find a way of saying that could happen. Um, I don't think it is necessarily the American people that have changed. I think it's the internet that has changed everything. I actually think it was Facebook. The advent of Facebook changed politics forever. And if you think about it, if you were a racist living in a village of 1,000 people in 1991, you probably thought you were the only racist in the village, and therefore you didn't sort of talk about it. You wouldn't admit it because you knew it was somehow shameful. But once Facebook came along, it enabled you to find out, actually, I'm not the only racist in the village. And then you could form a little Facebook group. And then you find other groups around the country that you can relate to and you can learn from what they do or learn from what they don't do. And all of a sudden, you've got a movement. And this is where, I mean, you don't have to be a dictatorship for this to happen. This is how the EDL really rose to prominence, I think, and gained some traction. It's how Andrew Tate gains traction among young people. I mean, I'd never heard of Andrew Tate until sort of the charges were laid against him. But I remember going to a school and doing a talk to, they were all sort of 16 to 18. And I was horrified that all they wanted to talk about was Andrew Tate. And it was quite a revelation in a way. So it allows people and groups to become more influential and powerful than they would have been able to be in years gone by. And I wonder if the internet had existed in previous centuries or previous decades, whether history, the whole history of the world, might be very different now.
Because and you look at the classic Nazi control of propaganda. It's quite scary to think what they might have done with a tool as powerful as that.
No, absolutely.
I'm really struck. George Wildsmith asked the question whether or not elected representatives communicating by social media has actually contributed to the decline in turnout at elections and desire for dictatorship, and is the right response to social media to fight the good fight in that world, or actually revert to a sort of old-fashioned, more traditional form of politics? I mean, that's George's question rather than mine.
I think that today's group of politicians generally don't seem to understand what the electorate think of them as a group of people. I mean, everybody can say, "Oh, my MP's really good," but I mean, MPs themselves are all lying, thieving bastards, and that is what most people seem to think now. And you can say, well, it's the fault of the politicians that they don't really get how to communicate properly. Some of them do, some of them don't. But I mean, I had one of the new Labour MPs on my Cross Question show just after the election, and he'd been on the show before, so he knew what it was. And all he kept doing in answer to every question was saying, "Well, I'm here to support the Labour government. I'm a Labour MP. I don't have any opinions of my own." And after he did it for the third time, I'm afraid I lost my temper with him. I said, "What's the point of coming on a show where you know that you've got to offer opinions? Otherwise, what's the point of it? Why bother coming on if that's all you're going to say? It's boring." And then you will have a reform politician come on who speaks human. Now, people might not like what they're saying, but they actually come across as a genuine human being and believing in what they're saying. And that's the danger at the moment, where you've got politicians in, I would say, all three of the mainstream parties who don't seem to know how to connect to the electorate in a way that they can actually respect what they have to say. And you can say, well, it's also the media's fault for wanting to polarize everything, that the constant search for a newsline from an interview, which if you're on one of the breakfast shows, for example, or the drive time shows where it's pacey, 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 the politician comes on for 5 minutes, they've got something they want to impart, and they'll impart it whatever they're asked. The interviewer has got an editor in their ear screaming at them to get a newsline, and it just becomes so sterile that it's the listener who loses out. And this is where I think the long form interview is slightly coming back into fashion now through podcasts. You're never going to get a 25-minute interview or a half-hour interview or an hour-long interview on the Today programme, but on podcasts you are. And of course, once politicians have got all their sound bites out in 5 minutes, then they have to sort of reach for new things, and it can be quite interesting. So I think we all have to look ourselves in the mirror, whether we're politicians, whether we're broadcasters, and also whether we're individual members of the public, and saying, look, are we being unrealistic in what we're expecting from our politicians? We basically want them to do the job for nothing, and yet we complain when we get rubbish politicians. And at the moment, we are getting, I think, too many rubbish politicians, because it's only the political geeks that will put themselves up for election, because they don't really care about all the abuse they get. Any normal person wouldn't even think of doing it nowadays. That's the tragedy.
But it's not just the geeks, is it, as well? It's the people who enjoy the power as well,
Yeah,
or the power trip. So it's worse than a sort of neutral, that they live in their weird academic world or political world, in which it's quite exciting to get
yeah.
obsessed with forms of electoral reform. It's actually the nature of the character it attracts of people who like to be attracted by power. Let me take you back just to a comment you made earlier about Trump, and how actually it's quite difficult to start playing with the American Constitution, and therefore he's probably America probably is insulated. He might take a lesson, of course, out of Putin's book, and decide that he wants to be vice president for 8 years. Don't know my constitution well enough to know whether that's a possibility. But I wonder whether then, in British terms, you see actually Britain as more vulnerable, where we're so much more reliant on the what is it, the good chaps version of politics to protect us constitutionally. Do you think Britain is perhaps more vulnerable than the States?
No, because I think our parliamentary system mitigates against it, because we're not electing an individual as prime minister. We are electing a member of parliament, and then parliament comes together, and a government is formed. And okay, it's the political party that selects the leader, but they are still subject to the wishes of parliament. I mean, I think our constitution was sorely tested during all of the Brexit negotiations. That was probably more down to John Bercow than anything else, he said controversially. Um, but I don't think we are in danger of succumbing to a dictatorship, and I'm certainly not. Even if Nigel Farage became prime minister, I don't think Nigel Farage is anything like an aspirant dictator. I think he does respect the constitution and the traditions. I mean, it would be an interesting few years if that were to happen. I'm not saying I think it will happen, but even if it did, I think Parliament is strong enough to withstand any tendencies that a Nigel Farage figure might have to go in a direction that this country wouldn't tolerate.
So what do you make, Helen Corkin picking up the survey, but there's actually plenty of different versions of these surveys, which are showing that Gen Z actually are not particularly excited by democracy, and given a choice, would rather have a strong leader. What
Yeah, I remember when that came out, I was quite surprised. But then again, if you look at the political youth movements at the moment, I'm told that Reform UK has an incredibly strong following among 16 to 20-year-olds, which you wouldn't necessarily have expected. But it sort of it falls into the conclusions of that poll. I mean, there's all sorts of weird and wonderful conclusions that the poll came to, and it's quite difficult to conclude why that is. Is it the COVID overhang, where maybe people who were at school during that period are now sort of entering their late teenage years, and they feel so let down by what happened during COVID and what's happened after, that's having an effect? I don't know the answer to that. When we find out that only what was it, 4 in 10 16 to 30-year-olds are proud of their country. I mean, again, if you'd done that even 10 years ago, it would have been much higher. That only 10% would fight for their country. I mean, these are, if politicians don't take these things seriously, I mean, we are going to be we should be careful what we wish for in 10 or 15 years' time, because it may be that people of that age group have almost decided to opt out of current affairs and politics altogether. And then we really are left to the zealots.
I see Helen calling me on my interpretation of the poll, although it's not the one survey. There's a whole series of surveys showing an increasing level of support for non-democratic options. I see Vicky's turned her camera on, but I'm going to crack on with just one or two more questions. So Rod Rivers says, will AI increase or decrease the likelihood that democrats would decide? So it's more about democratic systems than dictatorship.
I'm not going to pretend that I understand anything about AI at all. I'm ashamed to say that it's one of those things that when I go into LBC of an afternoon and we're deciding what to cover on the program, if one of my producers says, "Oh, there's this really interesting story about AI," I switch off. Now, that's the reflection on me. I completely get that, but I don't understand. I don't understand it. I'm making efforts to try and understand it, because clearly it is going to have a massive impact. I mean, I do use Chat GPT, and it's an amazing thing, and I still don't have a clue how it can work. But you look at that and you think, well, the logical extent from that, it means that within 10 years, possibly our entire society is going to change, but I have got no clue as to how it would impact on politics and government. And beyond, it's going to be much easier to make videos and films which no one will know if they're true or not. And that is deeply worrying.
So let me finish by asking you a question, which I know you know lots of, as a result of writing this book. And let's try and finish with a degree of optimism. How do dictators fall?
Well, in all sorts of different ways. And this is actually where I suppose you can take some encouragement for it from what happens at the end, because very few of them die in their own beds. I mean, some do, but a lot do not. They can be subject to coups themselves. I mean, Putin is rumored to watch that video of Gaddafi's body being dragged through the streets in Libya, and will play it literally on a spool, because he's very aware that that could happen to him. And so almost his entire being is devoted to making sure that it can't happen to him. Hence the sort of ever increasing powers of the secret police, hence the increasing number of dissidents who contribute to the amazing number of people who tend to fall off balconies in Moscow. I mean, it's higher than I think any other city in the world. So they can be assassinated, obviously. I mean, there are many examples of dictators being assassinated. As I say, there are some who do lose elections and then sort of disappear off into a quiet life. Very few of them end that way. Some of them go into exile. Obviously, Assad is the latest one to do that. So again, there is no common theme as to how they lose power. But as I say, very few of them end up dying in their own beds.
Which of course plays into the brutality that you see, because they come to identify their own survival with the country. One last question then: is there anything that the people on this call should be doing to insulate the countries that they care about, the places they care about, against dictatorship as a result of this? But anything that any job for us all?
Well, it's a trite thing to say, but we get the politicians we deserve. And if we don't take part, I mean, some people listening to this will know that before the last election, I tried to stand for Parliament, and for one reason, that the Liberal Democrats found that I'd said something stupid about the constituency that I wanted to stand in. I ended up not doing it. Now, the reason that I had, at the ripe old age of 61, decided to do it was that I could see what was about to happen to the Conservative Party, and I wanted to play a part in rebuilding it. And I thought, well, if I can get elected into Parliament, there'll be a lot of new Conservative MPs who are going to be a lot younger than me, and I think I can play a role in achieving that. That was most of my rationale for doing it, apart from the fact that I'd always wanted to. But I genuinely thought that my time had been and gone. Well, as it turned out, I was right. So in a sense, I don't regret doing it, because I do think I was doing it for the right reasons. But so many people nowadays do not even think about going into whether it's local politics or national politics, because of all the issues involved with it. And I think that's a shame. And the fact that all of you have joined this conversation today means that you have an interest in politics, I imagine. And I'm not suggesting that all of you should immediately rush away from this conversation and try to go on the candidates list of the party that you support. But it would be quite nice if 4 or 5 of you did, um, and try and contribute to a better politics in the future, because I think we do take it all for granted sometimes, and I think we're at almost that tipping point where too many people take it for granted.
Yeah, and that's fantastic. And one of the things that, I take from not just your show, but from the way you conduct yourself, is, I think, keys to this is seeing your political opponents as your opponents, not as your enemies, and not as
Yeah.
it's a real challenge.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. Last night, covering the Trump-Starmer events in Washington, um, I mean, I still self-describe as somebody on the centre right. I voted Conservative at the last election, and I probably will do in the future. I have voted for other parties in local elections. Um, but I don't regard my role as a broadcaster to sort of be an advocate for the Conservative Party. And last night, I thought Keir Starmer played an absolute blinder in a way that I really didn't think would happen. And so I said so. And then you see the reaction. I mean, from most people say, well, that's really good that you can see good in others, that you don't necessarily agree with their politics, but you can call it out as good when you see it as good. But then there are others who regard you as a complete traitor to the cause. And I mean, I'm now invariably described on social media as a Lib Dem. I
What?
mean, and I'm thinking, well, I still support Brexit. I don't support PR. I believe in a small state. I believe in low taxes. So if I was a Lib Dem, I'd happily say so. And there are good things about the Lib Dems. I mean, probably on social policy, I'm probably more in that direction. But I find it frustrating that everybody has to fit a certain narrative now. You have to be if you're not in the same silo as somebody else, you are regarded as somebody who's betrayed the cause or betrayed an enemy or become an enemy. And I think that's really, really sad.
Ian, look, I could go on, and I can't believe we finished the time, but your book is sort of fading into my background in a
Yeah,
way.
well, I haven't got a background, so let me hold
Excellent.
it up. And it is available on Kindle as an audio book as well. And the paperback, I think, is coming out in August. Pretty
I
sure, anyway.
really recommend it for anyone else who had the poor history lessons I did. Let me hand over to the Lib Dem Vicky Pryce to take.
Well, first of all, thank you both. I thought that was a fantastic interview. I mean, what comes out for me is that we need more women leaders, obviously. So women leaders, here we come. With a bit of luck, that will encourage more. So we'll have fewer dictators. Also, on that interesting survey that's been done about how the younger generation votes and so on, it's also happened in lots of other countries. And what we see is that it's the young men who move to the right, while young women move to the left. And I think that's quite interesting in itself. I would like to know a little bit more about why that is the case. maybe the two issues that we just raised about how women perhaps run things or would run things and how they may want to vote is they're linked. Even though the older generation, we always thought that women were more conservative than the men, but actually seems to even there be changing. What I did want to do then, apart from sort of thanking you and thanking you both, it's also thanking Sophie Cheadle and Georgie Pike, who made sure that this happened and happened terribly successfully. I have to say, I think this has been a great session. I need to remind everybody that if they want to contribute, please do support Radix Big Tent and the Big Tent Foundation, do a donation or as a friend. And also that we have this series of events have been happening now for these interviews for the last few months, one a month. In fact, we have two in March, if I remember correctly. One is with John Kay on his new book on how to understand business, or did we actually understand at all how business functions, on March the 10th at 6 p.m. And then we have one also that month later on the 25th with Julia Hobsbawm on her new book on working and the new practices. So to which I contributed a chapter. I think she's taken a leaf from your books, if you like, Iain, sort of getting people to produce chapters for her books, and lots of others are doing it. So there's competition going on.
Well, she's a great woman, and I'm doing an hour with her on that book on my LBC show at some point. So.
Oh, well, great. Just to say thank you all for participating. I hope there wasn't anything I forgot. Ben, do tell me. And perhaps if anyone wants to undo the camera and wave and clap, then please do, which I think would be great as a send-off, at least for now, for Iain. And we look forward to hearing you again on LBC tonight or whenever you're on it next. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Vicky.
Vicky. Thank you, Iain. That was brilliant.
Cheers.
Brilliant.
Okay, bye everyone. Bye-bye. Thank you.